arrows, war clubs, stone-tipped spears, and the corpses of 8 Viking men lying on a beach in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, in the year 1004. That is what Native Americans did to the very first Europeans who invaded the Americas 500 years before Christopher Columbus. When Viking warriors arrived in North America around the year 1000, they came expecting to conquer, as they had conquered England, Ireland, France, Russia, and the shores of the Mediterranean. They found instead something they had never encountered in all their raids and voyages: a people who could kill them, a people who could drive them out, a people who would eventually erase their entire colony from history, leaving only shattered saga accounts and mysterious archaeological traces behind, and a people who, when they captured Viking warriors alive, did things to them that even the most brutal Norse berserkers had never imagined possible. Today you will discover the shocking truth of what happened when the Vikings met the Native Americans, and specifically what happened to those Norsemen who were taken alive. It is a story that has been almost entirely erased from popular history, but it is the true story of the first great collision between European conquest and indigenous resistance in the Americas. And it is a story that ended, definitively, in complete defeat for the Vikings. Let us start with what we know for certain. Around the year 986, a Norwegian named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland. He sighted the coast of North America but did not land. 15 years later, around the year 1000, the son of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, purchased Bjarni's ship and set off with a crew of 35 men to explore the lands Bjarni had described. Leif sighted 3 regions, which he named Helluland, meaning stone slab land, which was probably Baffin Island; Markland, meaning forest land, which was probably Labrador; and finally Vinland, meaning wineland, which was probably the northern tip of Newfoundland. Leif and his men wintered at a place called Leifsbude, or Leif's Booths, and then returned to Greenland the following spring, loaded with timber and wild grapes. Leif's discovery was confirmed archaeologically in 1960, when Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the ruins of a Viking settlement at a place called Lanso Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Excavations revealed 8 buildings, iron nails, bronze pins, spindle whorls, and other Norse artifacts. Radiocarbon dating and, more recently in 2021, precise dendrochronological analysis of cut wood published in the journal Nature confirmed that the Vikings were at Lanso Meadows in exactly the year 1021. Lanso Meadows is therefore the first confirmed European settlement in the Americas, 500 years before Columbus. But the settlement did not last. It was abandoned. Why? To understand that, we must turn to the 2 great Icelandic sagas that describe the Viking voyages to North America: the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Both sagas were written down in the 13th century, based on oral traditions transmitted for 200 years. And both sagas describe in detail what happened when the Vikings encountered the people they called Skraelings. The word Skraeling is Old Norse. Its exact meaning is debated by scholars. Some say it means the wretched or the shabby people. Others say it means those who shout or those who scream. It was, in any case, a term of contempt. The Vikings, arriving with iron weapons and centuries of raiding experience, assumed the Skraelings would be easy to conquer. They were catastrophically wrong. The first Viking to die at the hands of Native Americans was Thorvald Eriksson, another son of Eric the Red and brother to Leif. In the year 1004, Thorvald led a small expedition to explore the coast around Leifsbudir. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, one summer morning while sailing along the coast, Thorvald and his men spotted something strange on the beach. 9 dark shapes clustered together on the sand. They approached carefully. As they got closer, they saw that the shapes were 9 men, sleeping underneath 3 upturned skin boats. The Vikings, without hesitation, attacked. They killed 8 of the 9 sleeping men on the spot, tomahawking them with axes, running them through with swords. One managed to escape. The Vikings, satisfied with their raid, went back to their ship to rest. But what they did not know was that they had just made a fatal mistake. The escaped Skraeling was returning to his people with news of the massacre, and within hours, a huge flotilla of Skraeling canoes was approaching the Viking ship. Thorvald and his men prepared for battle. But the Skraelings were smart. They did not simply attack. They kept their distance and they used their bows to rain arrows down on the Viking ship. The Vikings, with their heavy iron shields, deflected most of them. But one arrow found a gap between the shields and struck Thorvald in the armpit. He fell to the deck of his ship. As he pulled the arrow out and looked at the blood pouring from the wound, he understood that he was dying. Sagas record his final words. Quote, "This is a fine country we have found. There is plenty of fat around my innards. Bury me here on this headland, and put a cross at my head and another at my feet. Call the place Crossanes forever after." End of quote. Thorvald Eriksson died and was buried by his men on a Newfoundland promontory. He became the first documented European to be killed by Native Americans, 500 years before Columbus. The Vikings did not give up. Around the year 1010, a large expedition led by an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni set out to establish a permanent colony in Vinland. Karlsefni brought about 160 men and women, including his own pregnant wife Gudrid Thorbjarnadóttir, cattle, sheep and supplies for a multi-year stay. This was a serious colonization attempt. At first, things went well. Karlsefni's people found land, built houses, and started living off the abundant resources of Vinland. Then one day, a group of Skraelings appeared. They came out of the forest carrying furs. The Vikings, cautious after Thorvald's death, prepared for battle. But the Skraelings did not attack. They wanted to trade. They laid out their furs. They pointed at Viking swords. But Karlsefni forbade his men to trade weapons. Instead, he had his wife Gudrid bring out fresh milk from the Viking cattle. The Skraelings, who had never tasted milk before in their lives, drank it greedily. They gave up all their furs in exchange for milk. The Vikings congratulated themselves on their clever trade. But this peaceful moment did not last long. According to the saga of Eric the Red, a Viking bull, one of the cattle they had brought from Greenland, suddenly rushed out of the woods bellowing loudly. The Skraelings, who had never seen a cow in their lives and had no idea what this enormous horned beast was, panicked. They ran back into the forest and disappeared. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then they returned. This time they were not carrying furs, they were carrying weapons, and they came in enormous numbers. Karlsefni ordered his men to form a defensive line. The Skraelings attacked with bows and arrows, killing several Vikings in the first volley. Then they brought out something the Vikings had never seen before. Warslings, or perhaps some kind of ballistic weapon, described in the sagas as long poles with dark blue balls, roughly the size of sheep stomachs, attached to them. The Skraelings hoisted these poles into the air and hurled the balls at the Viking positions. When the balls struck, they made terrifying noises, and the Vikings were psychologically overwhelmed. Some historians believe these weapons were skin bags filled with animal fat, honed like grenades, or possibly bags of hot coals wrapped in leather. Whatever they were, they broke the Viking morale. The Vikings began to retreat toward their ships. And here comes one of the most famous scenes in all of Norse literature. The retreat was becoming a rout. The Skraelings were pressing forward. Viking men were falling. And then from the middle of the fleeing Vikings, one woman turned around and stood her ground. Her name was Freydis Eiriksdottir, illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red, half-sister to Leif and Thorvald. She was 8 months pregnant. She could not run fast enough, but she was not going to die running. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Freydis picked up a sword from a fallen Viking. She turned to face the Skraelings. And then she did something that shocked even them. She tore open her tunic, exposing one of her breasts. She began to strike her exposed breast with the flat of the sword, over and over, howling like a berserker. The Skraelings, who had been advancing confidently, stopped. They stared. Whether it was the sight of a heavily pregnant woman striking her own breast with a sword, or the terrifying warrior howl she was making, or some cultural interpretation of the act that we can no longer recover, the Skraelings turned and fled. Freydis, alone and 8 months pregnant, held the entire Skraeling attacking force at bay, long enough for the surviving Vikings to reach their ships. Karlsefni's colony was doomed. Even with warriors like Freydis, they could not maintain a foothold in Vinland. After 3 years of ongoing conflict with the Skrælings, Karlsefni abandoned Vinland and returned to Greenland. His son, Snorri, born in Vinland during the expedition, was the first known European born in the Americas. But that historical distinction was small comfort. The Vinland colony was finished. Now here is where the historical record becomes murkier. And here is where we must ask the real question of this video. What did the Native Americans do to the Vikings they captured? Because there were Vikings who did not return. There were Vikings who went missing. There were Vikings whose bodies were never found and whose deaths were never explained. And there is significant archaeological and anthropological evidence about what likely happened to them. First, we know from the sagas that there were Viking prisoners taken. The saga of Eric the Red mentions that during one of the battles, 2 Skræling boys were captured by the Vikings and taken back to Greenland. They were eventually baptized and taught to speak Norse. This shows that captives were being taken on both sides. But while we have records of what the Vikings did to their Skræling captives, teaching them the Norse language and converting them to Christianity, we do not have direct saga accounts of what the Skrælings did to their Viking captives. However, we can reconstruct with high confidence what happened, based on what we know about the specific Native American peoples who lived in Newfoundland and Labrador at that time. The people the Vikings encountered were most likely the Beothuk, an indigenous people of Newfoundland who had lived on the island for centuries before the Norse arrival. The Beothuk are extinct today, the last of them dying in the 1820s as a result of English colonization. But what we know about their culture from oral traditions of neighboring tribes and from early European contact suggests specific practices for handling enemies captured in battle. The Beothuk, like most indigenous peoples of the northeastern woodlands, practiced ritualized warfare that included the taking of captives for specific purposes. Male warriors captured in battle were sometimes tortured to death in public rituals designed to demonstrate the courage of the tribe. The captives were tied to trees or poles. They were mutilated in stages designed to prolong their suffering. Their fingers were cut off, their ears were cut off, their skin was cut in strips. Hot coals were applied to their bodies, and they were expected to sing their death song, boasting of their war deeds and mocking their captors, right up until the moment they died. For Viking warriors, this experience would have been particularly humiliating. Viking culture placed enormous emphasis on dying gloriously in battle, sword in hand. The Norse warrior expected to die swinging his axe against his enemies, hoping to be received into Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where warriors feasted eternally. To be captured, stripped naked, tied to a tree and slowly tortured to death by a people the Vikings considered inferior savages, was a fate almost inconceivable for a Norse warrior. Yet this is very likely what happened to some of them. Second, some Viking captives, especially the younger ones or the women, may have been adopted into the Beothuk community. This was a common practice among the northeastern woodlands peoples. Captives who showed skill, who could learn the language, who could contribute to the tribe, were sometimes absorbed as full members. It is possible, therefore, that some Vikings ended their lives not as glorious warriors falling in battle, but as ordinary members of a Beothuk band, learning to hunt caribou with stone-tipped arrows, learning to build birch-bark canoes, learning to speak an Algonquin language, and eventually being buried in Beothuk graves that would never be identified as containing European bones. Third, some Vikings may have been kept as slaves. Slavery was practiced by many indigenous peoples of North America, including probably the Beothuk. Captives could be kept for years, forced to do the hardest labor, and treated as subhuman until they died of exhaustion or exposure. For a Viking warrior, this too would have been a nightmare fate. In Norse society, slaves were called thralls and were considered the lowest of the low. To become a thrall to Skrælings would have been the ultimate degradation. Fourth, and this is perhaps the most intriguing possibility, some Viking captives may have been used as trade goods. Recent archaeological discoveries have shown that Norse objects, iron nails, spun wool, and even a portion of a Norse sword have been found at indigenous sites far north of Newfoundland on Baffin Island. This suggests that Norse materials, and possibly Norse people, were being traded northward, perhaps from Beothuk to Dorset to Thule Inuit communities in a network that stretched thousands of kilometers. It is possible that a Viking captured in Vinland could have ended his days as a slave to an Inuit family in the high Arctic, thousands of kilometers from Newfoundland, having been passed as trade goods from one indigenous group to another. Archaeological evidence also reveals disturbing facts about the fate of the L'Anse aux Meadows settlement itself. The site was systematically abandoned, but the archaeological record shows signs of hasty departure. Objects were left behind that any careful settlement would have taken with them. There is evidence of fires that may have been extinguished quickly. And critically, there are no Viking graves at L'Anse aux Meadows, not one. This is remarkable because in a settlement of any size, some people would have died from natural causes, from injuries, from illness. But the archaeologists have found no Viking burials. Where did the dead go? There are several possible explanations. The Vikings may have practiced sea burials, wrapping their dead in furs and sending them out on the ocean. They may have cremated their dead and scattered the ashes. But another possibility, favored by some archaeologists, is that not all Vikings who died at L'Anse aux Meadows died from natural causes, and that their bodies were not properly buried by their surviving comrades. Some may have been captured by Skraelings during raids, and their bodies never recovered. Some may have died in ambushes far from the settlement and been left where they fell. There is one more piece of evidence that has intrigued historians for centuries. When Danish colonists arrived on the Greenland coast in the 1700s, hundreds of years after the Viking colony there had died out, they occasionally reported meeting Inuit people who had physical features that suggested European ancestry. Blonde hair, blue eyes, features that did not match the typical Inuit phenotype. Some of these Inuit people had oral traditions that mentioned distant white ancestors who had come from across the sea. These traditions could refer to the Norse colony in Greenland itself, which lasted until the 15th century, but some historians have wondered whether they could also refer to Viking captives from Vinland who were traded northward and eventually integrated into Inuit society. We may never know for certain. The historical record is incomplete. The sagas were oral traditions written down 200 years after the events. The Beothuk are extinct, their oral traditions largely lost. The archaeological record is fragmentary, but what we can say with confidence is this: the Vikings, the most feared warriors of medieval Europe, encountered in the Americas a people who could defeat them, who did defeat them, who drove them from the shores of Vinland after only a few decades of contact. And whatever happened to the Vikings who were captured, whether they were tortured to death, adopted into tribes kept as slaves, or traded northward, they never returned to Greenland or Iceland to tell the story. Why did the Vikings lose to the Native Americans? This is a question that has fascinated historians. In Europe, Viking raiders had conquered kingdoms, terrorized entire regions, and demanded tribute from powerful kings. In North America, they were defeated by people they considered savages. What went wrong? Several factors help explain the Viking defeat. First, the Vikings were outnumbered. A Viking colonization expedition might include 100 to 200 people. The Beothuk and other indigenous peoples of Newfoundland and Labrador had populations of many thousands. The Vikings could win individual skirmishes, but they could not win a sustained war of attrition against a much larger enemy. Second, the Vikings were far from home. Their supply lines back to Greenland were tenuous. Every arrow lost, every sword broken, every warrior killed was difficult or impossible to replace. The indigenous peoples, by contrast, were fighting on their home territory with all their supply lines intact. Third, the Vikings were not prepared for the indigenous style of warfare. Norse warriors expected to fight in shield walls, in set-piece battles where the two sides met openly. The Skraelings fought a symmetric warfare. They attacked from ambush. They struck and disappeared into the forest. They used psychological warfare like their mysterious ballistic weapons. The Vikings had no counter to these tactics. Fourth, the Vikings had come without adequate technological superiority. Yes, they had iron weapons while the Skraelings had stone-tipped weapons, but the Skraelings had bows, and a bow can kill just as effectively as a sword or an axe. Iron armor could not fully protect against arrows shot from cover. The technological gap was not decisive. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, The Vikings could not sustain the war psychologically. They had left Greenland to find wealth and easy conquests. Instead, they found a determined enemy who killed them in ambushes, who tortured captured warriors, and who never gave up. After a few years of this, the Norse morale broke. The colonists returned to Greenland, and within a generation all direct memory of Vinland faded from the Norse world. Let me finish with this. The story of the Viking encounter with Native Americans is one of the most important yet least appreciated stories in world history. It represents the first sustained European attempt to colonize the Americas, and it ended in complete failure. It also represents one of the earliest recorded examples of indigenous peoples successfully resisting European expansion. If the Vikings had succeeded, if Vinland had become a permanent Norse colony that grew and prospered, world history might have looked very different. The Americas might have been colonized by Norse peoples centuries earlier than they actually were by other Europeans. Different diseases might have been introduced, different cultural exchanges might have occurred, different empires might have risen and fallen, but that did not happen. The Vikings were defeated. The Beothuk and their neighbors held their land for another 500 years, until European colonization returned, with much larger populations, deadlier diseases, and firearms that finally broke indigenous resistance. But for those 500 years, from around 1020 to 1500, North America belonged to its original peoples, and they held it in part by doing whatever they did to the Vikings they captured. Whether that meant ritual torture at the stake, adoption into their bands, slavery, or being traded away to distant Arctic tribes, the message was clear. The Norse, the terrors of medieval Europe, could not conquer here. This land, the Skraelings said with their arrows and their ballistic engines and their unforgiving winters, was not for taking. The next time you hear the Vikings called the most feared warriors of their age, remember Vinland. Remember Thorvald Eriksson, dying on a Newfoundland beach from a Skraeling arrow, telling his men to bury him at Crossanes. Remember Karlsefni's men fleeing in terror from the mysterious blue balls hurled at them by Native American warriors. Remember Freydis Eiriksdottir, 8 months pregnant, tearing open her tunic and striking her breast with a sword to shame her retreating countrymen and terrify her indigenous enemies. And remember the Vikings who did not come home, the unnamed warriors who fell into Skraeling hands and were never seen by their Norse kinsmen again. Their bones lie somewhere in the forests of Newfoundland or Labrador, or perhaps buried in the graves of Beothuk villages that were themselves destroyed centuries later. Their fate is one of history's great mysteries, but their defeat is one of history's great truths. The Vikings, the mightiest warriors of medieval Europe, met a people they could not defeat. And that people did to them, in the year 1010, exactly what invading peoples have always risked when they invade a land that is not theirs. They lost.